Welcome back to the show, everybody. We are so excited to have you back. We have a very unique show agenda today. David will be taking the lead. I'll be adding in some color commentary here and there. And today we'll be talking about a topic that I think David also believes is very pertinent to understanding politics today and the conservative movement and where it is heading. That is populism through U.S. presidents and their policies, and essentially looking from a historical lens at the populist ideals in America and how they will function to create a more successful conservative movement in 2021. David, you want to begin?
The Andrew Jackson presidency was probably the first populist wave, though it was through a presidency, not a movement of grassroots. Jackson was in many ways successful, and in some ways he wasn't. His biggest push was against the banks. You have to understand, back in the 1830s, they didn't have a national bank, but they wanted one. They didn't have like the Federal Reserve, and Jackson wanted to prevent the charter from it, because back then they believed, there was a lot of people who believed that the progress of the nation was hurting people, which sounds weird. That sounds anti-progress. You know, why wouldn't you want technology? But 66% of the nation was farmers. So like technological advances in industry didn't necessarily help the farmers. So
David, what you're postulating, right, is that it wasn't that they were fearful of just progress. They were more so
fearful for their everyday life.
Their lifestyle being rapidly taken away from them and being unemployed. Not progress, right? It's more difference. I think we see that today, right, with the adoption of technology and automation.
Yep.
Instead of trying to balance, right, this adoption of technology alongside many jobs that are done through manual labor that employ a large swath of the populace. Conversely, we see sort of an ignorant viewpoint towards it, where we say we should just merely push through all of that. We should ignore these.
Learn to code, they say.
Exactly. The John Kerry learn to code line. Yes.
Yeah. Exactly. They weren't really afraid of progress. They were afraid of being left behind by the industry. And like I said, 66% of the nation. And so that was kind of the populist movement back then, anti-progress. They called infrastructure improvements internal improvements back then. And so Jackson was very anti what we would say progress, but he was anti-internal improvements. He was against the bank, although for good reason he was against the bank, because back then currency was not a very stable thing back then. So loans were, the banks would just give out loans willy-nilly and cause inflation and terrible panics. And so I would be against the banks back then too, to be honest.
Well, to be quite frank with you, I don't think anyone should ever be pro big bank.
No.
That's been evidenced throughout, right, the policies of Bill Clinton, which transcended to the Bush presidency and consequently formed the 2008 financial crisis. I think that it's interesting, speaking of the history of the populist movement, that there has been this reshift, right? Or that's not a word, but there's been a shift in the embrace and the endorsement of Wall Street finance and big banks, right? Previously, under a Jackson era, right, under the Jackson era, you saw that economic populists and populists that were on the right rejected these big banks and Wall Street, and essentially. And then as time moved along and as the nation progressed, it slowly turned into Republicans and conservatives working alongside these financial institutions. And once the Trump presidency came, we see sort of a reiteration or a recycling through of this once again, rejection of the big banks that have caused many of the financial issues in America.
Yeah, the unholy alliance with the conservatives and corporations started around Hoover. You kind of saw like this anti-business with both sides of the party all the way up until after the progressive era. Even the William McKinley, Benjamin Harrison, and Teddy Roosevelt were all, big on busting trusts, although to a different degree, and we'll get to Teddy Roosevelt's not so great legacy, false legacy of busting trusts in a minute. But they were all kind of anti-big business. It wasn't until Hoover when they made the unholy alliance with corporations and free trade, and it kind of just went off the rails all the way until, like you said, you started to see a backlash with Buchanan and Perot, and Trump kind of like brought the national movement to it years later.
Absolutely. It is so interesting to see the cyclical nature of politics. I think often people call Donald Trump an unprecedented president. In many ways, yes, he was. But the core beliefs that he holds on fiscal policy, on economic populism at large, are not necessarily new to the right-wing movement. I think that's where people fundamentally misunderstand him.
You can go like back during the Woodrow Wilson period, when the whole country was contemplating involvement in World War I. Most of the country did not want to get involved, though the Democrats very much did. And most people must understand that the Democrats, for almost in our entire history, have been pro-war. It's never been the Republicans. The only Republicans who have been pro-war are a northeastern neocons that have never had a national constituency. And the only reason the neocons have power now is because George H.W. Bush, who was a neocon, was Reagan's vice president. That's the only reason they have power now. But back to the Woodrow Wilson, one of their slogans to keep us out of the World War I was America first. We have to put America first. So this stuff isn't new. Trump's just bringing back an old brand of very popular republicanism.
So do you think that the reason they do so, right, they call Trump this radically unprecedented candidate, this unhinged man that is destroying the fabric of the country, they do so not out of necessarily ignorance, although I am sure that is part of it, that they are ignorant to the history of this country. But I think it's to attempt to downplay the fact that this idea of populism that Donald Trump has brought about, in fact, has succeeded in the past and has been used in the past by a host of people and a host of elected officials.
Well, it goes to the point where the neocons are in power, and they've never been in power. The George Bushes, who now control the party, that type of Republican, they were never a national constituency. They were never going to survive, and their only real threat would be a type of Donald Trump type constituency who could actually make the party thrive. Back in the 60s, this type of Republican was known as the George Romneys, the losers of the party. George Romney was Mitt Romney's dad. These people couldn't win anything. I mean, George Romney was the first one to start releasing their taxes. I mean, these people were nothing. Again, the only reason they are relevant is, in my opinion, is because H.W. Bush was Reagan's VP.
So transitioning a little bit here, I know you and I discussed it briefly, or I should say that you were discussing it with me as you were informing me about this matter. How do these ideas play into the presidential candidates and the roots of, essentially who the Populist Party nominated and how that graduated into who Republicans nominated for presidential elections?
Well, so we could take a view for today. We see one of the biggest issues, and we saw Josh Hawley talk about it, and he is right to an extent. Now, Josh Hawley is 100% right. I think I said Columbia Bugle was a little bit wrong on who was the original trust buster. But he is right. Josh Hawley's completely right. The Republican Party has its roots as trust busters. And it goes all the way back to Benjamin Harrison, who passed the Sherman Antitrust Act. Grover Cleveland, the Democrat, did not want to enforce that in his second term when McKinley took over. He started a commission to start busting up these trusts. So going through the achievements of Teddy Roosevelt, you'd be surprised. Even though his legacy is the trust buster, his legacy is the trust buster because he was the first one to vigorously enforce the Sherman Antitrust Act. He sued 45 trust companies, but he only had 2 major Supreme Court wins. Now, they were big landmark wins, so I'm not downplaying them. But that was all he did. He didn't get any antitrust law passed. He didn't have any major achievements on trust busting. It wasn't until Taft that they got antitrust law passed and they started busting up big Standard Oil and big tobacco. And so the idea that Teddy Roosevelt was the trust buster is kind of misleading. But 100% Republicans, their legacy is they've been the trust busters, which is weird because for so long they have been in bed with big business.
So extending that line of thought, right? We talk about, or you have talked about with me again, that there is a sense of Donald Trump not being a Teddy Roosevelt populist, right? But instead an Andrew Jackson populist. Do you want to speak just a little bit more to that idea, that notion? Yeah. Because I think that's critical for our audience to understand, is that populism in the 21st century, and specifically 2021, has come to be viewed as an all-encompassing sort of movement. But it's critical to note that there are different types of populism, and these types of populism are underscore what types of policies are put forward and whether or not the nation actually moves forward with this conservative movement.
Yeah, and populism's, the policies will shift from era to era based on the needs of the public. Just like Jackson was concerned with anti-progress, or what we would call anti-progress, the Teddy Roosevelts of the world were concerned with big business and stuff, but the way they went about it was enhancing government power. In my opinion, you are a populist because you want to address the needs of the citizenry and better their lives, but you do it without enhancing the power of the government. If you enhance the power of the government, then you aren't a populist, you are a progressive. And in society, there are only populists and progressives. And Teddy Roosevelt was a progressive. I mean, he was for the inheritance tax. Donald Trump repealed the inheritance tax. Back when Teddy Roosevelt was president, there was no income tax, and he was proposing an income tax even when it was unconstitutional. It ended up getting, a lot of his proposals, policy proposals, ended up getting passed into law by Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 2 of the most progressive presidents ever. I'm not saying that this makes Teddy Roosevelt a bad guy. I'm just saying that Teddy's policy solutions are not the way we want to go about things. For example, Teddy Roosevelt, in the Square Deal, part of it was something called the Antiquities Act. He wanted to preserve sacred lands, parks, and everything. Well, there are provisions in there to where the government can seize land in the name of conservation, and every president since Roosevelt has abused that just to make things federal land, up until Trump. Trump has basically unrolled all of that. Now, people out where we live in the Midwest and in the East don't know about that. But if you go out to Utah, Wyoming, Colorado, they know about that. And they don't like that because they've lost a lot of their public land. And Trump rolled back a lot of that. And so Teddy Roosevelt and Donald Trump are 2 very different people.
Yeah, it's critical to note that a lot of people say, we want to go back to the Teddy Roosevelt days. No, we don't. I don't think we truly do. I think there are individual aspects of a Roosevelt, however you want to pronounce it, presidency, that are desirable or salient to a Trumpian candidate or presidency again. But at the same time, on the whole, you want more of a Jacksonian type candidate.
Yeah, because in going back to the Jacksonian type, there's the lesson that Jackson taught us, which was very important about populism, is that liberty and power are always in conflict with each other. And you can have populism fighting for liberty as long as you understand power is always trying to take that liberty from you. So like with the banks, you have to be aware that those banks are not in your good interest. So having a national bank may seem like a good idea for the populace, but in a broad scheme, it isn't. At least not in 1830. So, liberty and power was the lesson of the Jacksonian era, and I think it should apply now. Everybody who's pushing for Republicans to have a healthcare plan by the government, I'm telling you that is not populist. That is progressive. That is a danger. Giving government more power over you is not the point of populism, because populism normally starts when a corrupt government stops representing the people. Why would you want to give more power to the government?
How about this? The government, besides incredibly rare occasions, will never cede power back to the people. It will only usurp. It will always take. It never feels the need to give. You can even look at the $2,000 checks. They don't value your life at more than $2,000.
It's not even $2,000. They're not even going to give us $2,000.
They don't even value it basically $1,400.
Yeah.
And so, with this in mind, right, what you see is on a larger scale. We've talked about specific policies. On a larger scale, you want populism to represent common sense, common man policies that champion the everyday citizen. Progressivism actually does not champion the everyday citizen. It champions the role of the government intervening in the lives of all of the populace. That affects all branches of people, regardless of socioeconomic status. I think people get that confused.
Yeah. You look at the early 1900s progressive movement. Before that, and I can't remember when it was passed, whether it wasn't under Teddy Roosevelt, but I can't remember if it was under Taft or Wilson. But they changed the senators from being appointed by the legislators to being directly elected. Now, because of that, we elect senators for a 6-year term, and we can't recall them. And basically, it has created this swamp-like thing where the tenure is crazy. I mean, Mitch McConnell just got elected to a 6-year term, and he's untouchable for 6 years. And there's a huge problem that Mitch McConnell is in leadership. And because of that, and that's because of back in the early 1900s, the progressive movement changed the way we elected senators. And actually, you can go back. It really stemmed from the populist movement of the 1890s. The populist movement of the 1890s had good intent, but some of their policy goals were things like direct election of senators. So it was easy for the government to co-opt the movement into a progressive movement, into addressing these issues through a government lens. And I mean, the consequences are still felt today. The way we elect senators, it seems novice, it seems non-consequential, but like I said, Mitch McConnell's there for 6 years, and there's nothing you can do about it.
Absolutely. And this push for term limits is something that a populist movement champions, but has not been necessarily brought to the forefront of policy, simply due to the fact that there are so many other pertinent matters, which is understandable. But at the same time, again, people are frustrated with the government. If that's the case, one of the best ways to reestablish legitimacy in that regime is to restructure it in some ways. And that doesn't ultimately completely change the government entirely, but it is a critical and important change to making sure that there are candidates that actually represent the will of the citizens.
Yeah, very important. Again, that's why that's why the Jacksonian movement is so unique, because you would never ever dream of a populist movement being anti-infrastructure, anti-capital, but they were. But that was the needs of the people back then. That was 66% of the populace that needed it, and that's why Jackson won 2 overwhelming victories in election, because he represented the needs of the people. Now, those issues would never fly today, but that's what the needs were then. And populism isn't just a set of issues that last throughout time. They rotate throughout period for whatever the needs of the populace are. So the needs in the 1890s were different than the 1830s and the needs today. Today, the needs are big on trade, and now monopolies are emerging again. And that worries me, because that it seems like we're going to head towards the progressive way, because everyone has a big government solution to fixing monopolies. So I don't know.
I want to bring up and transition a little bit here to the modern day populist movement a little bit more, right? We've talked about the connection between modern day and historical, but specifically focusing on the current era. You see people call people like Josh Hawley and Ron DeSantis populists. What do you think about that? And in answering that question, maybe we should also discuss Hawley's recent decision to put forth a $15 minimum wage legislation, which I thought was very, very interesting, and in my opinion, was a negative or would create adverse consequences. But what do you think of how people just are starting to label a multitude of candidates as populist?
Well, I was running a crap ton of polls like a week ago or something, and I found something interesting, that people perceive Hawley as a straight up populist without question, and they perceive Ron DeSantis without question as a conservative. Now, I'm not sure what that means, although Ron DeSantis being perceived as a conservative is not going to help him in the Rust Belt. I'll just say that right there. I'm sorry, Ron DeSantis fans, but that's conservative is a dirty word. Anyway, but Hawley and DeSantis being America first, if you will, they have the policies, they champion the policies. I have questions on Ron DeSantis. I mean, I don't know if you watched my YouTube video that I just put out, but I talk about the policies he enacted as governor so far. And if you dig into his immigration policies, his sanctuary city policy actually exempts the children's services from complying with ICE. So you actually codify a part of sanctuary cities. Same with E-Verify. He exempts the private employers from E-Verify, which is just makes the law moot because of all the private employers that use cheap labor in Florida. I mean, what's the point? So, I mean, like, how is he really enacting America First agendas, or just does it look like it and he's trying to fool you? I don't know. Hawley is to be determined. Hawley talks a really good games, got great charisma, but he hasn't done anything. I will point this out, though. Both of them owe their political fortunes to Donald Trump.
Yeah, I don't think that they get nearly as far without Donald Trump, for one. And I think for two, they're going to need the support of Donald Trump to win, because quite frankly, they are two highly educated, candidates. And while that's not necessarily a bad thing, I think it's a good thing. I think you want a refined and reformed person that is running for office that simply doesn't play to the populist voter in the Midwest. And so these Harvard graduates, I'm not sure where Hawley went, but my point being,
I think it was Yale.
But these very well put together, well-spoken candidates play well to more, lukewarm conservatives, maybe in Arizona and Florida. However, they will not garner nearly the same support in the Midwest.
Yeah, they're like Trump and Jackson were a lot alike. Even though Jackson was a general, he was a former governor, and he was well-to-do, a great politician, but he was a larger-than-life larger than life guy, a lot of energy. He was unconventional, a little unhinged, just like Donald Trump is a lot of big bombastic. Trump is well educated from a great family, but you wouldn't know that by his personality. And so that kind of traditional blue collar way that Jackson and Trump act kind of appealed to the everyman. Whereas, and Barnes said this, someone asked him, does Trump have a chance in 2024? And Barnes said, well, right now, what he has going for him is there's no one that can challenge him. His second closest guy is Hawley, who's a Yale graduate. So that goes to what you said, is that sometimes being too polished doesn't help you in Western Pennsylvania.
Right. And I think that going along with that same thought, Trump was also unique in his ability to appeal in ways that maybe I think DeSantis and Hawley cannot. And I think that it seemed far more genuine when Trump made these appeals because he was an outsider. And Hawley and DeSantis are going to have to contend with the fact that for as much as they plea with the American people and make their case, they're still insiders in many ways.
Yeah, and I was watching a 2018 GOP primary debate between Putnam and DeSantis, and DeSantis came after Putnam for being a career politician, and then Putnam came right back at DeSantis and said, "You've ran in 3 elections in 6 years. That's a career politician on ADD." And I'm thinking, wow, DeSantis just tried to be a non-politician like Trump, and it came right back in his face. It's like, because he can't. Because as much as you respect DeSantis for being the fighter that he is, he doesn't have the credibility of being a non-politician because he isn't.
Yeah, right. I mean, that's basically what it is Trump's one of his greatest assets is that you could never accuse him of true corruption because he was never technically connected to political dealings. I mean, maybe when he was a private businessman, but his actual policies were completely distinct from those. And in addition, right, he was never actually the one that was formulating these policies that had adverse outcomes, right? He was just utilizing them to run his own business. So he understood the corruption that was inherent in the system.
Yeah, I think people are going to be surprised at how poorly Ron DeSantis is going to appeal in places outside of Florida, Georgia, and North Carolina. He's going to do well in the Sun Belt because everyone knows who he is and they'll just vote for him. But did you see any of his CPAC speech? Because he was great on policy. He was well received because he's the governor of Florida. But the way he delivers his speech is just so stiff. You know, look at the notes.
It comes off as somebody that is too well rehearsed.
Yeah, he just
fluid, right. It's almost too fluid and smooth, right? It comes off almost so eloquently that you start to think it's a little bit unnatural.
Yeah, and he only has one tone. He doesn't emote or anything. He just has that one tone, and then he looks at his notes way too much.
Well, Donald Trump's greatest feature, for instance, is that he takes a couple notes, but the guy goes off script all the time. That's why people love him. He just speaks from the heart.
Well,
go ahead.
Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz did the same thing yesterday. They used no notes. They were just going ab lib. And then you have Ron DeSantis up there basically reading from a script. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. Sometimes a written speech is good. But if you want to make a connection to an audience, if you want to get a big rally crowd, reading from a script every time is not going to excite people. Cruz and Hawley had a lot of energy yesterday, and they had a lot of charisma, and I think people are kind of a little blind to how weak DeSantis is because he's such a great governor, and he is a great governor. I'm not saying that he's a great governor.
He absolutely is. But I would say that in many ways that he's being revered too much. You see people posting, it's time for Trump to get out of the way. DeSantis needs to come in. This movement doesn't exist without Trump. It doesn't go anywhere without him. Well, and that, whether you like it or not, whether you like Trump or not, if you want the movement as a whole to succeed, you need Donald Trump to have a prominent voice within it.
At least for the next 4 years, because someone's got to lead us through 2022 and then anoint the next successor, whether it's Trump or someone else.
It's not going to be DeSantis.
I don't think so, and I'm glad you agree with me because I feel alone. I find it weird.
I think that I actually believe Ted Cruz would be a better candidate in many ways. And now I understand he hasn't been perfect. He had a pretty bad blunder with leaving for Cancun, but as a whole, I like Ted Cruz better than I like Ron DeSantis. Right? I think Ron DeSantis sort of came out of the woodworks without truly ever strongly standing with the president. Ted Cruz was willing to argue before the Supreme Court for Donald Trump.
DeSantis was nowhere during the election. And you could say what you want about Kristi Noem. Kristi Noem stormed the country during the election campaigning for Donald Trump. And everyone wants to say, oh, but she has a small state and DeSantis has the third largest state. So it was an election. Get your butt and start fighting for the president. Get out there and campaign. I mean, and DeSantis didn't go campaign for the president in other states except for Florida. Kristi Noem was in New Hampshire, Iowa, Ohio, North Carolina. She even appeared with the president in Arizona. I mean, she was all over. I mean, and dude, Kristi Noem is incredibly likable. I mean, I'm not saying I'd vote for her because she's kind of like a likable Nikki Haley in terms of policy, but she's got it. I'm telling you, she could do okay. Just saying.
I continue to believe my favorite card is Trump Gabbard. It will never happen. It's a pipeline dream. But if it does occur, I would be incredibly elated.
Well, in terms of the movement not surviving without Trump, I don't know why people insist that the movement would be stronger without Trump. Barnes is in. I have my issues with Barnes, but I also like Barnes because I've learned a lot from him. But this movement, this is not the type of movement that can survive without its leader. You go back to the Jacksonian Revolution, started in 1824. When he left office in 1836, they needed him in 1837. They needed him to get Van Buren elected because Van Buren was just a suit, you know. Then Van Buren lost re-election in 1840, and they had to call back the old senile Jackson to get James K. Polk elected. And he did. He got James K. Polk elected. But then Jackson died shortly after the election, and there was never another Jacksonian elected again. The movement died with Jackson because no one could replace his persona. I mean, I just read a book about Jackson, and one of the debates after Jackson left office was, we have his policies, but how do we replace his energy? They couldn't replace his energy. And I think that's the problem with Trump, is that you can have a Ron DeSantis or a Josh Hawley, but you're not going to replace Trump because Trump is too big.
His character is simply irreplaceable. I think that the closest you ever get is maybe with someone like Don Jr., his son. I think that that's the only way you can even get remotely close for now. Obviously, there might be candidates that emerge. But outside of Don Jr., you don't have someone with that dynamic sense of character, of pizzazz, of showmanship, essentially.
Yeah, obviously there's that other option where there's someone we haven't heard of yet that could take the stage. But we don't know who that is yet because we haven't heard of them. I tend to think that Don Jr. is the most talented person in Trump's orbit. I don't care what people think. Trump's getting better on staff. He kept Lewandowski and Miller around while he got rid of the rest of them, because here's the thing that about leaving the White House. The people who are just there for a job don't stick with you, while the loyalists do stick with you. So, yeah, he's got Jared with him, but Jared's family, he's not going anywhere. I'm sorry. And Jared is a liberal. I'm not saying he isn't, but he's there. And so we have to deal with it.
And I think people get so upset, right, to some extent, I think it's important to have diverging voices, and I wouldn't say that I agree with many of the policies, but people want to act as though Trump should have this unitary, uniform group around him that is just yes-manning him nonstop. Guess what? Jared Kushner is one of the primary reasons that there was peace in the Middle East and the Abraham Accords. Yeah. People don't recognize that. Look what's going on right now. As soon as Trump leaves, I know Trump had a large voice in it too, but you have to understand that there are certain members that while they might be detrimental in some ways, they are highly beneficial in others. I'm not saying that that in the future, if Kushner somehow has a role in the White House in 2024, that he doesn't have to be curtailed. He will. But you also need someone like that in your cabinet.
Yeah, we have to take the good with the bad. Kushner was great on foreign policy, and then he's probably best to keep away on domestic policy. Now, he probably was too involved in domestic policy. I think the biggest issue that I've noticed, and people hinted about, Barnes has hinted about it, Gordusky has hinted about it, but they won't say it outright, is that their biggest issue with Kushner is that Kushner did a lot of the hiring screenings. And so he blocked a lot of their friends from getting hired. And so I think they have a personal issue with Kushner. And I think that's what it is. Because I don't know how you can be that hateful of someone. And then as they attack this guy nonstop, they just spread more hate and venom throughout the movement towards someone.
There is an underlying part of the populist movement in modern America, David, you and I have discussed this, that is a little bit too radical and needs to be brought back in, right? They need to be reeled in a little bit.
Yeah.
They go after right, minority groups. They go after religious sects.
Israel.
They go after Israel and Middle Eastern allies. They are overly isolationist, overly protectionist, right? And they emphasize, right, a sort of manifest destiny like scenario that is unrealistic in 2021, essentially.
Yeah. And then there's the part of the movement that has this unrealistic vision for the movement that can never be achieved, like Sebastian Gorka not being MAGA enough. I mean, if he's not MAGA enough, then nothing is MAGA, and your vision isn't realistic, and your goals will never be achieved, and all you're doing when you're attacking people for not achieving your vision is just angering people and dividing people. And that's on you, man. You're not benefiting people. You're not helping the movement.
Exactly. There is a sense of, I pointed to Cernovich as a primary example of this.
Yeah.
There is a subset of this group, right, this populist group, that believes that they are intellectually, philosophically, morally superior to everyone else in the populist movement.
It's the hero syndrome.
Yeah, and consequently, they simply want to say that everyone else is inferior, they are not good enough, they need to listen to us because these people are all weak. But simultaneously, they never do anything to actually fix that problem that they supposedly say is so rampant or rotting so rotten in the group.
Yeah, and I think post-presidency, there are some people out there who are just simply angry at the president, not because of what he did, but because he takes up so much energy in the movement. And to them, that's a bad thing because that prevents them from doing what they want to do, from primarying who they want to primary, endorsing who they want to endorse. Not to attack Barnes or Barris. I'm not attacking them. I'm simply pointing out an observation. They did a whole entire What Are the Odds episode about their frustrations about this whole thing. And Barris explained it like, oh, we just want him to get better. But dude, you were kind of clear about how you were mad that that you can't do your own nonprofit because he takes up so much energy. I'm like, there are too many people who want to benefit personally from this. And I like Barris, I like Barnes. I'm not attacking them, but there are people out there who want to benefit personally from this, and it's not going to help this movement if there are too many heroes in the movement. And quickly here, have you been hearing about Illinois 16, how there's Jack Lombardi and then Catalina Law? Both primary and Kinzinger. That's a problem because half the MAGA movement wants Jack, the other want Loff, and they're going to split the MAGA vote because they both have the hero syndrome, and Kinzinger is going to survive that primary.
Absolutely. This is a pragmatic example of what we've been discussing. You know, I've talked about this extensively for weeks now, is that everybody thinks they know what's best. And when they do that, they all decide, oh, we know better. And we're going to prove it. You're not actually going to prove anything. In fact, what you're going to prove is that your selfishly motivated behaviors are going to result in a horrible Republican like Adam Kinzinger getting through and being elected.
And then they're all going to blame Trump.
Right.
Yeah.
Here's the deal. Choose one. I don't care who you choose. It's not my district, right? I have my own opinion on the matter. The point is, get behind one candidate, throw all of your resources and energy behind that one person, and get them through.
Yeah. Yep. Because Kinzinger will lose if you're not going to split the vote. But if you split the vote, he'll survive.
Exactly. I think that sort of leads us into maybe a final wrap-up point here. Where do you see, right, this populist movement? Where do you see the biggest impacts occurring in 2022? What elections specifically, maybe?
I mean, hopefully we get Liz Cheney, John Thune out. I'd like to see Laura Trump win in North Carolina. I'd like to see some new senators, better populist senators in Pennsylvania and Ohio. But if there's as much rivalry and hero syndrome as we're seeing already this early, then I have my doubts as whether this can work. Too many people are trying to be the hero.
I agree. We come together, we succeed, we splinter, we fall apart, and Democrats maintain control. Well, David, that was a fantastic show on a greater in-depth look into the history of populism and the conservative populist movement. We will be back next week, most likely with a new guest. So be sure to tune in to that. And David, I will speak to you soon.
Yep.